Hello, everyone, and welcome to this isolated talk. Love a pun, great name. My name's Rob, and I've been asked by Giles to contribute with a little talk, which makes me slightly nervous because the roster of current talks is pretty impressive, and then there's me. So I thought I would do something that was a little bit different, probably a little bit silly, but I'm a bit of a meme nerd amongst other things. And I've actually been finding that, a solid stream of memes has been quite helpful in these weird times. So I went on a massive stretch and just thought maybe there's some wisdom we can take from said memes. And so I want to share some of them with you and hopefully make some sense along the way. So welcome to The Wisdom of Memes by Rob Estreitinho. That's how I say my last name, by the way. So this is me, obviously those are not my glasses, but I like a Venn diagram because I am a strategist. So I did a Venn diagram about the things that most interest me. And it kind of comes down to this. So I am a big nerd about strategy things. That is kind of my job. I've always been a nerd when it comes to philosophy things. And I'm also a bit of an internet nerd. It's been my career to understand things going on online, how that affects and is affected by culture, and make some sense of it to the rest of the world, the people who are not, to quote a friend, extremely online. I would say I'm extremely online very often. Anyway, so yeah, this is kind of me in a nutshell. And funnily enough, the way I spend my time outside of work is kind of expressed in some way by the intersections of these different areas. So, between the strategy and internet stuff, I'm a partner of an organization called Groupthink, which does monthly events for strategists. On the strategy and philosophy thing, I write a newsletter called Salmon Theory, which kind of just explores philosophy ideas and tries to apply them to strategy, amongst other things. And then I don't really have a project that completely is a cross section of philosophy and internet, but I guess let's consider this talk that. So why not? So yeah, kind of write 3-ish things every week on a newsletter, which is in this link if you want to check it out. Yeah, I'm also part of the team that runs Groupthink, where we do monthly remote events for strategists, amongst a variety of things. When I say memes, by the way, I don't mean the Richard Dawkins definition, which I am not intelligent enough to completely articulate for you. I do mean the slightly more nonsensical thing on the right. So just wanted to be really, really clear in case anyone decides that a rebuttal of this talk would be, but that's not how Richard Dawkins defined a meme. All credit to Sir Dawkins, but I am, we're at different levels. He's like Champions League. I'm whatever the third league in England is. Anyway, the meme stuff on the right, not the biological meme stuff on the left. That's what this is about. And I think, unsurprisingly, I should warn you that some of this may not make a lot of sense, much like a lot of memes often don't make a lot of sense. A lot of these things might just be flights of fancy, and they make sense for me, but may not make sense for you. And do you know what? That might be a good lesson in itself. Take what you want and fuck the rest. That's kind of how I approach knowledge. We don't have to completely agree on everything and see the world in the same ways, but just pick and choose what you want, man. And yeah, so things might get weird. Shall we get started? Let's get started. I want to start with this meme, which I found very funny. By the way, I follow philosophy meme accounts on Instagram. If you want some tips on who some of the best ones, or at least my favorite ones, hit me up. But this one was quite interesting. And by the way, I just realized it's going to probably be weird that I don't want to try to explain the meme for you. So my hope is that I will stall for a few seconds, like 10 seconds, so you can read it and hopefully make sense of it for yourself. And then I'll explain what it means to me. But, you know, this is the first meme. People under Corona, suddenly nothing has really meaning anymore. And philosophers for the last few centuries just go, ooh, awkward. So what does this tell me? Sort of, where's the wisdom in this? For me, it's that all meaning is manufactured, and that is absolutely okay. I think, you know, for philosophy, I always call it a great tool for pessimists, and pessimists usually kind of see the weird and meaningless side of things. You know, why do things matter? What's the point? Etc. etc. I certainly relate to that as a default way of seeing. But the other side of that is that once you recognize that things don't have inherent meaning, you can kind of manufacture meaning for yourself. And you see a lot of that these days where, you know, you ask people, how are you coping and how are you dealing with stuff? And people just find these different silver linings and these little sort of, you know, small things that suddenly gain a disproportionate meaning in their lives. It might be the time you spend schooling your kid. I don't have kids, but I've spoken with people who have found a huge deal of meaning in that. It might be, you know, people spending more time exercising. You know, I don't want to go down on the, oh, now's the great opportunity to change your life type of narrative, because, you know, it can come across as a bit tone deaf. You know, not everyone has loads of disposable hours to, you know, launch their great new venture. But you know, finding whatever works for you as a source of meaning is kind of okay. You know, meaning is manufactured. It always has been. That's what stories are. We make sense out of things that on their own probably don't make a lot of sense. I mean, the universe is quite random. You know, the expert people in physics and sort of theoretical physics and not only, they are the first to admit, you know, the universe kind of doesn't make sense on its own. It's a bunch of weird random rules, and then shit happens. And lo and behold, here we are making meaning through stories and culture and relationships, and that's absolutely okay. You know, it's our way of dealing with the world, and I would argue is even more important dealing with today's world, with how things are right now. The second one that I sort of thought was interesting was this one. So stop treating personal experience as objective facts, or draw 25. I hope you play Uno, because otherwise this is not going to make any sense. And then obviously on the right, there are humans going, oh shit, you know, what do I want to do? So yeah, this one is kind of particularly important if you do strategy, but not only, you know, if you're a decent human being, this is kind of a good thing to bear in mind. You know, what we observe is not all there is, even if it feels like all there is to us. And this is kind of something that I've been thinking a lot about for a while now, which is, you know, it's become a bit cliche to say we live in post-truth times, etc. I would argue, you know, fake news has kind of always existed. There's good journalism on that from a couple of years ago about how even, you know, even before America was sort of founded as a country, there was a lot of sort of fake news tactics to try and rile people up against the king and stuff like that. But you know, the way I see it is, truth is fleeting, but until then, it's all we got. I think it's hugely interesting to look at how science approaches truth, because, you know, real science doesn't look at truth and go, right, we've sorted it, that's it. You know, when it's done properly, it's more about, right, we've uncovered this. We know this isn't blatantly false, but, you know, here you go, peers, not Piers Morgan, you know, here you go, my peers in science. That would be weird if Piers Morgan were in charge of determining what was scientifically true. I'm not going to get political. Anyway, the fact that scientists you know, grab their work and put it up to peers, and you know, a peer-approved article is essentially someone saying, or a group of people saying, okay, this has not been proven to be false, as opposed to this is now true, I think is hugely humbling. And maybe it's something we can learn a little bit more, that, you know, even if we believe something to be true today, doesn't necessarily mean that it will be true in a year's time, in 10 years' time. So, which, you know, and I don't mean by this, don't believe in anything. It's more that don't be afraid to change your mind as and when things change. And it's absolutely fine if you believe a thing that contradicts what you believed 5 years ago. That's growth, you know. We are all trying to figure it out. But truth is fleeting, and our version of truth is fleeting. But until then, just, you know, hold on to that motherfucker, because that's kind of all we got. Right, Joker meme, of course. You know, this one has been quite explored over the last year or so, but basically this one's about, you know, self-aware apes being all badass and shit. That's us. And then the absurdity of existence kind of just rams you on the street before you know it. You know, I'm a big fan of existentialism. You know, I'm not sure I have the mental fortitude to stick with it for too long and to read the source materials for too long, because it can get a bit of a downer. But it is kind of interesting to acknowledge the fact that existence is a little bit absurd, and that's kind of the hand we've been dealt. So, you know, I think making friends with absurdity often softens the blow. You know, this is what good comedy is. It's looking at something, realizing it is completely absurd, makes no sense, and yet kind of dealing with it and having fun with it and not being too freaked out about it. And, you know, arguably today, if we are to take, obviously there's a lot of things about the pandemic that we should take seriously, you know, staying home, taking your proper health precautions, and you know, social distancing, all of that stuff, please do take it seriously. But as far as the things you do to entertain yourself, if you're in that need, or to just deal with hardship, I always find that absurdity is kind of a good way of laughing at something that in theory isn't funny. And, you know, even in the Joker film, if you've seen it, or, you know, it's in the trailer as well, I quite like what he says. You know, I've always thought my life was a tragedy, and then I realized it was a comedy. I think there's like a lot of wisdom in that, because, you know, even if you look at, I don't know, a shitty argument with your fiance or your partner or whatever, it's always, I always found that if you can apply some humor after the heat has sort of cooled down a little bit, you know, you find that it kind of strengthens the relationship, to realize that such, you know, a petty argument about some pillows in the sofa is actually quite ridiculous. But here we are. You know, things like that don't have to be a tragedy, and often they feel like a tragedy when you're in the middle of, you know, an argument about nothing, about something that doesn't matter. But, you know, making friends with the absurdity of these things and seeing more things as comedy instead of just tragedy, or maybe they are tragic, you know, they are tragic comedies, and that's absolutely fine too. I find that it helps soften the blow and deal with hardship as and when it hits you. You know, it's like the, you know, when you go to, say, a funeral, which is obviously a very tragic thing, but it is a celebration of a person. And then there's always that person that kind of, you know, cracks a joke that gets everyone laughing. And, you know, I'm not advocating for you to try and be that person, but I'm just saying that there is space to embrace absurdity and humor, especially when things feel pretty fucking hard or meaningless. This one is quite like, so, you know, this one is basically postmodernism visiting different, I guess, sources of truth, or philosophical strands, or whatever you want to call them, and just slaying them one by one until it kind of hits its own door. And then, you know, stay tuned for the next episode. I don't know what happens next. I guess this is the moment where we are now, where postmodernism is kind of questioning itself, and everything feels a bit clusterfucky. But but what that tells me is that we often look at things as being linear and always always sort of traveling in a single direction. Whereas I think it's far more useful to look at things as cyclical. For example, I've been having some interesting conversations with people who also work in my industry and have an interesting point of view on the world, about like, what do you think's gonna stay after the lockdown starts getting lifted? Because, you know, now you see a lot of, you know, acts of kindness and a lot of things that people are doing to try and nourish their free time. But, you know, some of those things might return to you know, to pre-lockdown times, and you just go, fuck it, I don't need to do my, you know, my watercoloring habit. I don't need to do that anymore. But I like to think that a lot of things might stick around. But then equally, you could argue equally for both ways. You could go, the fact that people were in lockdown for so long led them to want to spend more quality time indoors. That's one version of truth that I think is possible. Another version might be the fact that people were in lockdown might propel them to now want to spend more time outdoors because there's a saturation around the house. That is equally true. And the thing is, we are going to observe both, and we are probably going to observe them in waves. So you're going to have a wave where the predominant narrative is staying at home is kind of cool now, you know, because everyone now is obsessed with, you know, playing Animal Crossing and doing board games and whatever. And they enjoy that as a way of spending their time instead of going out and eating out or whatever. And then that might be followed by a predominant narrative where people want to do more stuff outside of the house as a sort of an escape from that. And that's kind of the hard thing about trends, is that we try and stick to them as a single version of what will happen. But usually what happens is you have multiple versions, you know, the future is already here and just not equally distributed, sort of stuff. And probably these things do come in waves. You know, I remember years ago when automated vehicles started becoming a thing that we started thinking about. I was talking with one of my bosses, and we sort of came to the conclusion that one interesting side effect of autonomous vehicles becoming commonplace is that driving your own car is going to be like the apex of luxury if you're a car nerd, because if you think about it, there is effort to it. You technically don't have to do it, but you have a sheer enjoyment coming out off the back of it, and that is kind of the definition of a luxury. So, you know, for example, in that example, automated vehicles don't mean everyone's going to completely gravitate to that. You're probably going to have some people embracing the sheer utility of it, but then there's a counter cycle to that, which is a lot of people just go, do you know what? I'm just going to revert back to the traditional, wonderful legacy of driving my own car. It's a little bit like vinyl, you know. There's no objective reason apart from the quality of the audio to enjoy vinyl these days, and yet it is facing a resurgence. You know, similar with indie print magazines. If you bother to look, there is kind of a resurgence in sort of passion-led print magazines, despite the fact that you can find information about all sorts of stuff on the internet. But those things go hand in hand, and they operate as cycles instead of just everything one way or everything the other. Quite like that. So me thinks I have gained certainty in my positions, and then hypothetical counter arguments just show up and go, oh, hello, allow us to introduce ourselves. I don't know what that accent was. This one is, you know, a bit of a, if you like to think hard about things and have some, you know, analytical capabilities to go, oh, these factors are interesting, oh, but that's the counterfact, and just try and make sense by looking at both ways instead of just, you know, sticking to your positions and never changing your mind. What that tells me is that we kind of could benefit with thinking like our own worst enemy. And what I mean by that is, you know, despite your inclinations about how you see the world, I think it's important to recognize that, you know, we can assume everyone else who doesn't think like us is stupid, or we can opt to think that they might not be completely right about how they're seeing the world, or their conclusions might be wrong, even if their logic is right, or their logic might be wrong, even if their conclusions are right. but there is always some element of truth in how other people think. Which isn't to say you should agree with it, but you should at least acknowledge it and try and understand the logic of how they got to where they are. I think that's particularly important in the sense of what you discuss online, for example. There are certain themes that I just don't touch online, because I'd much rather have the either private or face-to-face context to talk to someone at length about things we may not agree with. And things like Twitter and stuff like that, I get the impulse of starting an argument about whatever, but I've always found that it's not really worth the effort. So perhaps finding ways to try and empathize with certain elements of how your perceived enemies think is kind of a useful thing to do. It doesn't mean you're agreeing with them, doesn't mean you're being swayed by them, but I think it is kind of important. We have much to learn from the people we disagree with as much as the people we do agree with. So embracing some of that, and maybe as a corollary to that, just not feeling the need to always correct everyone online is probably a good thing to do. It's going to save you a lot of sanity, if nothing else. So yeah, think like your own worst enemy, and trying to empathize with people we don't agree with, at least on one level or another. We might still think they're horrible people, but at least understanding where they're coming from is probably a good thing to do, at least as an intellectual exercise. Right. This one's a bit of it's a weird one. I hadn't seen this meme template before, so it's fairly new to me. But when you are in a conversation with someone and they say God is dead, and then you go, ooh, this conversation's so high Q, it's making my head hurt. So for me, this is about context, and it's kind of related to the previous thing. If you're watching this, my bet is that you're probably a relatively intelligent person, probably a bit, higher than the average, whatever. And, we all have a certain dimension of smarts that is useful and interesting, and probably, increases your value as a professional or as an individual. But I've started thinking a lot about how smarts is nothing without context. This is particularly thinking about how, again, often online, and I'm thinking a lot about Twitter in this case, just because it's like the easiest association that comes to mind. You see a lot of very smart people on Twitter who often, it feels like they forget where, the context of where they are. And the particular context of using Twitter is that it's really hard to have a nuanced conversation, because you get things like body language and tone and stuff like that, and it's really easy to come across as an asshole. So I guess what that meme makes me think about is that you may have really interesting points of view, but bear in mind the context of where you choose to display them, or you may even have a provocative point of view, but bear in mind the context of how you're displaying it to the world. I know that, it's probably not even done on purpose, but I know there are people who, try to be as provocative as possible online. And we do know that that gets attention, but at the same time, I wonder what that does to someone's reputation, where they're just coming across as a little bit of a dick. So, which isn't to say they're not an intelligent and thoughtful person, but the perception of how that comes across when you see online is probably something that we should think a little bit more about, which again isn't to say you're not entitled to having a point of view. Of course you are. But, if you decide to have strong political views on Twitter, don't complain that people are going to have equally strong political views as a counterpoint to your own, which for some people is probably a good thing. They kind of like it. I personally do not enjoy it. I get too anxious about it. It's just not for me. So the context of Twitter as a way to expose whatever smart point of view I might think I might have, I always try and tread lightly a little bit. And, if we are going to have a conversation about politics or something a bit more delicate, or an acknowledgement of our own privileges and stuff like that, I know I noticed that I tend to default to more private settings, small groups, a bit more immersive, where you can sort of stay with the nuances of what is being said, and you know, just explore certain ideas with a little bit more depth. Or you know, otherwise, just if you're at a cocktail party, whenever we're allowed back in cocktail parties, maybe your opening being "God is dead" is not the smartest thing to do. So yeah, that's kind of maybe a bit of a stretch, but there we are. I said some of this may not make sense. Right, bloody love this one. Oedipus on Tinder, you know, just going, I'm back in the dating scene after a long relationship. I'm ready to find another. The reason I love this is that I have this obsession with really old and really new stuff, which is to say that I love reading really old books about philosophy, as you may have imagined, but I also really love exploring the very new and, you know, online culture or new things people are doing or whatever. Yeah, that's kind of what this tells me, is that if you want to find an edge, then go to the edges. Don't just stick to the mainstream stuff. You know, you see a lot of people, and we always have moments where we do this as well, where we default to the same sources that everyone else has, which is it's a good thing to do if you want to just have a level of parity and understand sort of, I don't know, where are digital platforms headed, you know, what's happening with this, what's happening with Fortnite, etc., etc. But I always find that if you want to find an edge in how you think, you need to go a step further. You need to go to the edges. You know, don't just stick to the same celebrities or creators or news sources or people that everyone else goes to. Try and find inspiration in really fucked up places. For me, those fucked up places are, as you might have guessed, philosophy and memes. Not because I'm going to go, right, this philosopher said this, so we should do that, but it just helps me think differently. And if you do strategy for a living, your whole thing is about thinking differently. So if you want to find an edge, don't be afraid to go to the fucked up edges that everyone else is not paying attention to, because that probably means you're going to be thinking things that they are not thinking. And that is kind of the point. We are in the difference business, peeps. And if you want to get, you know, extreme results, you probably need to go to slightly extreme sources of inspiration. Though, you know, mind your mind, you know, that this came across as more totalitarian than I wanted it to. All I'm saying is don't be afraid to get a bit weird when you're doing your thinking. I love this because my 12-year-old sense of humor is still around, and I still enjoy, you know, Family Guy, or at least some of the classic clips, and I bloody love this one. So for those of you who may not be aware of what Stoicism and existentialism are, you know, Stoicism is, you know, it was a philosophy by, you know, it was sort of held by a few classic figures like Marcus Aurelius, Roman Emperor, Seneca, Epicurus, although he was more of an Epicurean. You know, I don't want to get into that now. But it was all about maintaining a sense of fortitude and grit when facing reality, and knowing what you can control, and you know, fuck the things you cannot control. And existentialism is more about, you know, recognizing that most things, you know, all things are pretty absurd because they have no meaning. Therefore, you can create any meaning you want. You know, and that's kind of the ultimate definition of being free. Is you know, there's a quote from Sartre, which is, "Freedom is what you do with what is done to you," which is a fancy way of saying, play the card you were dealt, and that is the definition of freedom. Don't hope that things were different, but you can use what you have to try and make things a little bit different for you. And then, you know, obviously when they come together, they might come across as a little bit of a weird point of view on the world. And, you know, this isn't specific about Stoicism or existentialism. It's just that these two things obviously were developed in different moments in history. And when they come together, they might come across as a little bit bizarre. In this case, an elephant that has the body of a penguin, you know, and that's kind of, I just explained the meme. Brilliant. The one thing I said I wasn't going to do. But what this tells me is that contradictions are kind of what makes us beautiful. And you know, I think often we try and get to very consistent rules about what it is to be a person. And the reality is the only overarching rule is that we are very, very contradictory in what we think and what we do. Even when we do stuff, we do then things that contradict past behavior, and so on. And that's kind of okay. You know, that's anyone who's completely consistent all the time, I would be a little bit suspicious of, because it probably feels like they are hiding something. Whereas people who are contradictory, you know, obviously there's some exceptions to this. Like, I don't know, if you're a publicly elected official, you probably don't want to be completely contradictory all the time. But if you're not, I'm not, and I imagine some of you or most of you are not, it's fine if sometimes we are contradictory. Because that is kind of what makes us interesting and weird and hard to pin down. You know, something that feels too perfect and consistent probably loses some of its substance along the way. And contradiction is kind of where substance always comes from, or often comes from. So yeah, don't be afraid to embrace contradictions in, you know, certain ways that you have in seeing the world. You know, it is possible to, I don't know, care about your local community, but also, I don't know, have some money in an ETF because you believe in the power of the stock market. You know, things can coexist, which obviously makes things harder to embrace and makes things harder to understand about how the world works. But, you know, contradictions are kind of everywhere. And that's not because they are a bug. It's because they are a feature of being a human person. Human person is a bit of a oxymoron, isn't it? Anywho, let's move on. Right, this one, love me some Tom and Jerry. This is, you know, this isn't meant to be topical, but at the time of this recording, I seem to remember that the guy who illustrated Tom and Jerry has passed away. So, you know, that's a bit of my childhood that's gone. But I loved Tom and Jerry when I was growing up, and I love this meme because, you know, it's philosophy and memes and Tom and Jerry all in one go. It's like a whole new Venn diagram for me. So yeah, Nietzsche, Socrates, and Schopenhauer essentially undermining a happy, unexamined life. So, you know, if you know Socrates and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, obviously they advocated for, you know, being really mindful of the things we pay attention to in life and examining our own actions, our own beliefs as a way to you know, find a greater source of value and values in terms of how we see the world and how we relate to others. And what that tells me is that although all of this sounds like a lot of hard work usually pays off in meaning. You know, if you hold a slightly more nuanced and complex view of yourself and people, you know, it's much harder than just believing simple theories about how things are and believing theories that don't change. But usually what that means is that, you know, you might be fine with just having a simple view of the world, but what usually happens is that worldview, because it's not as malleable, it may, you know, as soon as someone else presents a different narrative, it might sort of start shattering some of the things that you believe. You know, it's easy enough to believe simple, shallow ideas about how things are and about how we are and about the type of person we think we are. And it's much harder to absorb these different aspects of, you know, of different contradicting parts and different weird narratives on the world and things that don't quite add up. But I have to believe that by doing that, by having that hard task of examining the things we do and trying to change and not believing that we are perfect the way we are, which I think is a terrible piece of advice. You know, on some levels it's great because it means you're accepting stuff about yourself, but there's other elements that you probably want to take a hard look and see if that's what you want to be doing. And that act of hard work, of constantly or every now and then examining what you're doing, how you think, how you relate to others, I find that it pays off in meaning in the long term, just because you are more likely to be able to identify certain flaws or certain things that you do that it doesn't mean you're going to change them, right? If you are someone who has a particular obsession, it doesn't mean that you need to change that obsession. But it does mean that by acknowledging that that thing is there, and by acknowledging that there are certain trade-offs from obsessing about, say, reading a lot of stuff. Like, for example, I obsess about reading books, which I know often compromises the time I spend talking to people, like my friends and stuff. We still catch up. I'm just not a person who's always messaging back and forth with other people. But that's a trade-off that, it's taken me a while to be okay with. And hopefully it's not completely undermining the relationships I do have with people. But I find that it gives me a little bit more meaning in terms of understanding who I am, what my inclinations are, and what are the things that I'm sort of, I don't hold them as secondary, but it's not something that I'm as comfortable doing. But somehow that mix kind of works for me. So, it would be simple enough to just try and fit into a particular box of how we should behave. But I think that things are a little bit more complicated than that. So it's harder to examine our own feelings and our own actions, our own beliefs, but it does pay off in meaning because you learn stuff about yourself. And self-awareness is one of the most important things you can have, in this day and age, but since ever. That is literally where wisdom comes from. And we can only aim to try and get a little bit better or a little bit less bad at it as the years go by. This meme makes no sense. I mean, it kind of does, but it's fucking bonkers. So, is that a regular Unireverse card, or is it Friedrich Nietzsche's Eternal Return? And why is there a dog in there? This meme is absolutely nonsensical, but there lies the lesson, boys and girls. I think logic is overrated and momentum is everything. What does that mean? It means that although certain things in life are meant to be logical and you do want to take a rational approach to some of the decisions that you make, often we let logic get in the way of just getting something going. This might be a particular thing you've wanted to do for a while, or a particular project you wanted to do for a while, but for some reason are finding, there's logical barriers that stop you from starting. For example, when I started writing my newsletter, Salmon Theory, I tried to be really logical with it, which was kind of useful to, get some sense of whether it was even an interesting project to start. But over time, I quickly learned that I'd much rather try and keep momentum going with it, which means that I write in a stream of consciousness style. I don't, I obviously sense check whether the things that I put in there kind of make sense at some basic level. But beyond that, I'm more interested in just keeping it going and expanding on it and just building on top of it than necessarily feeling logical every single time. And that's kind of what this meme tells me, is that, the format kind of doesn't make sense, but at the same time, it's a brilliant example of someone just experimenting with the format. And when we're trying to do something creative, that's all we're trying to do. We're experimenting with contents. We're also experimenting with formats. So, when you're trying to do something that is of a creative nature, or trying to think about something, don't worry too much about being completely logical all the time, but do obsess about building momentum into it. Because, momentum leads to quantity, and quantity eventually leads to quality. So it's much more important, I think, to build momentum into the things that you do than necessarily being completely logical as you do them. Right. This one, you could replace philosopher with most other things, but literally any philosopher, copying from literally any philosopher. This is, it makes me think of when I studied communication in uni back in Portugal, and this one time in a journalism class, one of my teachers said that often journalists kind of write for other journalists, which is kind of one of the critiques of the journalistic profession. You could argue is also a critique of people in strategy. Sometimes they're trying to write strategy thinking about, the award thing instead of it being the right thing to do. which means we're effectively writing strategy for other strategists, not for trying to solve a problem. But at the same time, I think there's some benefit in that happening because, you know, in any given culture, you always find this habit of finding ways to perpetuate itself, which is another way of saying that it's a way for every single one of us in a particular culture or profession to keep pushing each other towards new levels. And, you know, I don't mean to say that that's the only thing that matters, but when you look at science and you know, people in academia and all of that, everything's just building on top of other things that came before it. And that's the nature of how ideas work. It's the nature of how worldviews work. And, you know, obviously don't plagiarize the next person and call it your own. But to quote from, is it Picasso? You know, the whole genius steals thing. Also, you know, obviously Ferris and Rosie Jakob also have that as the name of their agency. But there is truth to it, you know. If you are stealing from other parts of your culture and trying to find ways to mix things up, you know, you are perpetuating that culture. And that seems to be a trait of any organism. And I would put culture as part of an organism in itself, because you have multiple actors playing together in a systemic level in order to perpetuate that culture further. And that is literally what life's about, by the way. There you go. Biology lesson there, guys. I don't know anything about biology apart from this. This one, bit gritty, but a philosopher is a person who knows less and less about more and more until he knows nothing about everything. This one is dead simple to me, and it's something that I've tried to get better at, I suppose, or trying to be less of a dick about it. I find that these days it is kind of a rebellious act to not have a point of view, which is to say that everyone's a bloody expert in everything these days. And especially if you have a Twitter presence or you're on LinkedIn or whatever, there's this implicit need and this instinct to just have opinions about everything, which is fine if that's what you want to do. But I found that you know, although I do like having points of view on stuff, sometimes there's some bravery. I don't really like the word brave, but there is, you know, there's an element of humility in just going, do you know what? I don't know enough about that to have a point of view. You know, I don't know enough about epidemiology to talk about whether the different governments' strategies are better or worse. I mean, sure, you can look at the results and see, oh, the UK is worse on this level and that level. But quite frankly, I'm happy to hear other people's points of view. But as far as the broader implications of the pandemic are concerned, I don't have a solid point of view, and I'm not okay and I'm okay to admit that. You know, I don't. This is also related to, I guess, cultivating a smaller ego, which is really hard because I've always had a bit of a big ego, not because I had reasons to, and that's kind of the point as well. It's just that I've always been too insecure to not try and have a say in most things that I felt mattered. That's a bit of a weird sentence, but the point is, you come across sometimes, or you can feel a bit more confident if you just go, I don't know enough to, you know, to have a clear point of view on that. And you can either go investigate and try and change that. But if you're not inclined to do that, that's absolutely fine too. You don't have to have a point of view on everything. If that means you're just going to be stressed about everything. So maybe it's something we can learn a little bit more about. Which again this isn't a way of condoning ignorance. It's just a way of, you know, you can read about stuff and still not reach a solid conclusion, because it takes time to reach a conclusion. It takes time to build a point of view. And, you know, I've been reading as much as the average person about, you know, some of the science behind COVID-19 and some of the different governmental measures and so on. I could not give you a clear point of view on whether, you know, whatever's happening in the US is better or worse than the UK versus Italy. You know, it's just not something I'm comfortable talking about. I'm comfortable reading about it and, you know, being slightly confused about it because there's a lot of information out there. But you'll probably not find me having a strong view about it, and I'm kind of okay with that. You know, I'd much rather understand the nuances of stuff versus trying to get to a conclusive answer. There's no conclusive answers at this stage, and anyone who says there are is probably kidding themselves and whoever's reading them. Right. This one is great. When you're both cynical and dead inside, but still you have a lot of fun and good time together. This is, it kind of ties back to the absurdity thing in the beginning, but I prefer to think of it as a way of embracing the pain that is inevitable in life. You know, life has pain, there's painful moments. What we're going through right now is incredibly painful, and there are better days than others, but there are also worse days than others. But that's just part of the ride. You know, if you're not feeling pain right now, you're probably a bit of a sociopath. You know, if for some reason you're not feeling pain and you are not a sociopath, I'm not trying to insult you, but the point is, if you are feeling pain, that's kind of normal. You know, things are pretty fucked up. We can still try and find silver linings in other things, but you know, if there's a lot of things inside of you that just make everything feel a little bit unbearable, that's fine too. You know, this is not meant to be a situation that would deal with normally. So that pain is just part of the ride. And you know, nirvana is a bit of a weird segue. The whole idea of nirvana as proclaimed by Buddhism and, like, you know, being at one with the universe and all that shit is fine, but good luck trying to be completely mindful of everything 24/7, non-stop, and still you know, doing stuff in your life and trying to keep going. You know, so that's what I mean by nirvana is only a band. Don't aim for nirvana. It's really hard to, you know, even outside of a global pandemic, it's really hard to be completely mindful of stuff. Imagine when everything seems to be going to shit. You know, things will get better at some point, but don't feel the need to be completely positive and thankful and you know, just like that all the time. It's fine. It's important to cultivate that, no doubt, but it's also important to recognize that sometimes you just feel like everything is an absolute pile of shit, and you just need to stick with that for a little bit. You know, things come and go. Similar to the thing before about things being cyclical, feelings are cyclical too. Sometimes you go through extreme pain, then you have moments of happiness, and then you go back to pain. That's life. Nirvana is only a band. It's not real. I mean, maybe it is real for some, but for the vast majority, then, you know, us mere mortals, yeah, we're a bit more fucked than that. Right, this one. To do is to be, Jean-Paul Sartre. To be is to do, Socrates. To be or not to be, Shakespeare. Doobie-doobie-doo, Frank Sinatra. This probably is more funny for me than it is for you, but I like the idea of how this mixes like a lot of weird shit. It mixes different meme formats, it mixes different authors, it then adds a musician in the end. It's you know, there's layers in here, guys. But it does make me think that, you know, storytellers is a bit of a shit jargon, piece of jargon that we talk about, you know, I'm a storyteller and stuff. But I prefer to see whatever we define as storytellers as just master mixers. What's brilliant about this meme is that it mixes so many things and it creates a new template that people can use. And, you know, does that make it original? Perhaps. But what it does make me think, or what this help with, is in thinking that you can grab these disparate sources, putting them together, and it kind of feels fresh enough compared to what already exists. And that's kind of what, you know, news stories are. They are different mixes of settings, characters, plots, etc., based on past things that you've observed or understood. Which also goes back to the other thing about, you know, exploring the edges. The more you explore from different edges, probably the more original your thinking is going to come across as. And, you know, I'm not massively into fiction, maybe as, you know, not as much as other people say I should, or we all should. But, you know, when you think about an original story, the basic building blocks are always kind of the same, but the different references and settings and characters kind of change. So an original story is at best a really interesting and bizarre mix of new things. And I would argue an interesting or original thought is the exact same thing. So don't be afraid to mix weird shit and see what comes off the back of it. Lastly, when people start talking about stuff they read in philosophy books and your only exposure to philosophy is through memes, I am very guilty of this. I've tried reading some of Nietzsche's original material and goodness me, it's fucking dense. You know, same with, I mean, Sartre. I tried reading some of the original stuff. I kind of endure parts of it. I have I still need to read Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, which is kind of a seminal book in modern feminism. I'm really looking forward to it, but at the same time, I'm kind of dreading it because I have no idea. Although I like the basic premise of it, and I've seen some of the ideas expressed elsewhere, I'm slightly afraid that it's going to be a really difficult book to read. And you know, I'm okay with that because repackaged wisdom is still wisdom. You don't have to read all the original source materials from philosophy or history or whatever to still find ways to learn the lessons that those disciplines may offer you. You know, there's brilliant content out there in terms of like YouTube channels and, you know, in case in point meme accounts that they do give you glimpses of what certain authors meant. And if that's your way of absorbing that knowledge and trying to make sense of how things are, then good for you. You know, I often get better exposure to philosophy ideas through books that agglomerate past ideas, like the stuff that Alain de Botton does, and the School of Life, and some other authors as well. Or books like, which I haven't read, but I want to, Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy. You could argue he's not a philosopher per se, he's just documenting past philosophers, but mate, I'm absolutely fine with that. If that's the way to absorb the key ideas, even if it means you haven't read the original stuff, I don't care. You know, it's less important how you get to understanding a piece of knowledge than it is the fact that you do understand it. So you don't have to read thick books about philosophy if you want to learn about philosophy. So even if it is repackaged, it's still useful and could perhaps lead you to, you know, a tiny little bit of percentage of being a little bit more wise or a little bit less dumb. So yeah, I guess this is kind of my way of saying that all of these things, you know, this idea of like wisdom and stuff, they don't have to come from boring places. You know, people find wisdom in bloody cartoons. There's, you know, there's YouTube channels on the philosophy of House of Cards. If, you know, Wisecrack is brilliant at that. They essentially grab pieces of more mainstream culture. And yes, they do overlay more sort of complex philosophical ideas on top of it, but that's their way of interpreting wisdom. And I've learned more about philosophy through some Wisecrack videos than through, you know, entire books alone. There's no shame in that. You know, you pick your wisdom where you want to, man. And yeah, in this case, I looked at memes as an interesting vehicle for that. You know, if some people might be like, oh, but memes are just, you know, they're so shallow in their interpretation of the ideas. It doesn't matter. As long as you're learning something from it, it doesn't really matter what the particular format is. It matters if you retain some of the contents. So yes, repackaged wisdom is still wisdom. So chill the fuck out, academically driven people. That's me, guys and girls. Those are still not my glasses, as you can tell. But yeah, like if you're interested in stuff like this, like I said, I write 3 times each week. I sometimes interview people too on this newsletter and in that link. And yeah, I mean, it's an odd time to try and find wisdom and stuff, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. It doesn't mean you have to do it all the time, you know, get on with life. There's often more important, routinely things you need to take care of instead of, you know, trying to spend time finding wisdom in philosophy or whatever, or whatever you're doing. But, you know, having some of these reminders at hand is also really important, especially when the going gets tough. And things are tough right now. They hopefully will get better in the near future. But in the meantime, try and stay wise, kids. I'm going to stop now. Thank you very much. Thank you, Giles, for inviting. And I hope this wasn't too nonsensical. Cheers.